Okay, good morning and welcome everyone to this virtual Atlantic Forum event. I see that the participants are slowly joining, so we can start to kick off. My name is Alexandra Brzozowski. Some might know me as the EU Foreign Affairs and Defense reporter with Euractiv in Brussels, and I will be your host for this event. 2 weeks ago, NATO defense ministers held their first meeting with the new Biden administration's Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who promised European allies that with the change of the power in the White House, the days of American solo efforts would be over. At the same time, NATO's recent reform proposals on how the military alliance should tackle new challenges in its backyard are also set to be discussed and adopted by NATO leaders in the next few months. In this context, we're very pleased to welcome Oana Lungescu, NATO's chief spokesperson, with us this morning. Since 2010, she has been coordinating NATO's 24/7 media operations and planning and directing all aspects of summits and events, as well as providing strategic advice to NATO SecGen. In this event, Oana agreed to give us a preview of the upcoming summit and later discuss together how the new US administration and European allies could reinvigorate their transatlantic relationship and address emerging challenges. Without further ado, Oana, welcome again, and the floor is completely yours for the next 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and good morning to everybody. Thank you to the Atlantic Forum and to the young journalists and to all of those who've taken the time to join us today. Thank you in particular to the Atlantic Forum for all the work that you do. This is really valuable in connecting young professionals with NATO. And I know it's even harder these days because we can't meet in person. But on the other hand, it gives us an opportunity to meet perhaps not just in Brussels, but with people who are much, much further beyond. Now, when I was a university student, I couldn't even aspire to be a journalist. And certainly not even in my wildest dreams did I imagine that I would become NATO spokesperson. Because, of course, my native Romania back in the 90s was one of the most repressive countries of the communist bloc. And just talking about freedom of speech could get you into trouble. And, of course, NATO was the enemy. Also imagine, if you can, that at the time the internet didn't exist, social media didn't exist, we didn't have mobile phones. I know this is another planet, but this is how we grew up. So for us, it was books, it was foreign radio stations like the BBC, Deutsche Welle, Radio Free Europe, that opened a very small secret door to a world of freedom. And that was the world that we aspired to, democracy, individual liberty, the rule of law. These are the values on which NATO was founded in 1949. And NATO was founded as an alliance of Europe and North America, countries that made the most solemn pledge to one another that if one of them was attacked, it would be seen as an attack on all, one for all and all for one. This pledge has kept our country safe for the last 70 years, and it remains unchanged. It remains at the core of our alliance, even though now, of course, we have 30 allies, so we're a much bigger alliance than when we started. Over the last 70 years, and as my own story in a very small way has shown, the world has changed dramatically, and it continues to change in ways which are very hard to predict. And we only need to look at COVID-19 to see how unpredictable the world is and how interconnected we are, but also how interconnected the challenges and the threats are. So the main role of NATO during the COVID-19 pandemic has been and remains to ensure that this health crisis does not turn into a security crisis. Because while we have been dealing with COVID-19, all the other challenges and threats have not gone away. On the contrary, some of them have been amplified. And that includes a pattern of assertive, even aggressive actions by Russia, brutal terrorism threats, cyber attacks growing more complex, missile and nuclear proliferation, emerging technologies, the rise of China, which of course presents a lot of opportunities, but also challenges, and climate change, which also has security implications. As we can see, no country can face those challenges alone, and no continent can face them alone, which is why it's even more important today that Europe and North America work even more closely together. And NATO is a unique platform to do that. So this is the context in which the NATO summit will take place in Brussels later this year, because Alexandra has asked me to talk about the NATO summit. And also part of the context for the summit are some of the differences that we've seen, especially in the last few years. There have been some serious differences. There's been some loss of trust. There have been questions asked on both sides of the Atlantic about the viability, the strength of our relationship. We've also seen sometimes contradictory visions of what the transatlantic relationship is and where it should go. So right now, we are at a particularly important juncture, a time, a moment in time which presents a historic opportunity for us to strengthen and to revitalize the transatlantic alliance for the benefit of all of us. It's an opportunity to regain trust. And you'll have seen President Joe Biden's very clear message, including in his phone call with Secretary General Stoltenberg, part of which was filmed. You may have seen those clips on social media. And in that phone call and in all the other contacts with the new US administration, the message has been very clear that their focus is on rebuilding alliances and strengthening NATO. And that's why the Secretary General launched the NATO 2030 initiative as an ambitious and forward-looking agenda for the future of our alliance. And as the name says, NATO 2030, this is about today, and it's about being prepared for the challenges of tomorrow and the challenges for the day after tomorrow. So let me focus on three key points which around which the NATO Secretary General has structured the proposals, which he has tabled for discussion, and those discussions are now ongoing with capitals. And let me also say, because I see Tanya Latic, I think, has joined us, and she was part of the NATO Young Leaders. She is part of a group that is advising the Secretary General on his proposals, together with independent experts, civil society, industry, but there is a wide network of knowledge, expertise, enthusiasm, creativity, providing inputs into the Secretary General's NATO 2030 agenda and looking to the future and how we can tackle and address future challenges together. So there are three key points. First, to reinforce our unity, and that is both politically and militarily, to broaden our approach to security beyond what we have been traditionally seeing as security challenges, and to protect the rules-based order, which we have together built after World War II, and which we see is currently being challenged. So first, to reinforce our unity, That unity, as we've discussed, derives from that fundamental pledge to protect and defend each other. And so what the Secretary General is considering and what we're discussing is how we can further strengthen our commitment to collective defense and to deterrence. And one way to do that would be to fund more of our deterrence and defense on NATO territory together. And here we're looking, for instance, at the multinational battle groups in the eastern part of our alliance, or Baltic air policing, or exercises on maritime activities. So activities on NATO territory. And that could be one way to improve burden sharing and to provide an incentive to allies to provide more of those capabilities for the longer term. This is also about strengthening the political unity of the alliance, which we know has been challenged by a range of differences. At the same time, because NATO is the one and only platform that brings Europe and North America together every day to discuss, decide, and to act on issues of common security. And there's actually no other place like it in the world. This is a time to strengthen our political consultations here at NATO. So we're also discussing how allies can commit to consulting on all issues that affect our security, whether NATO decides to play a leading role or any role in them at all. As part of that, we also expect to launch at the summit a process to update NATO's strategic concept. For the NATO nerds among you, you will know that our last strategic concept, so the blueprint for how we see the world and what we do about it, was adopted over 10 years ago at the Lisbon summit, actually the summit where I started working as NATO spokesperson. So of course, it's a rather different document, and it describes a different world than the world we live in today. So we can talk about that perhaps later. But this would be about charting a common course forward together and also recommitting to the fundamentals of the NATO alliance. So that was the first point, reinforcing our unity. A second point to look to the future is broadening our approach to security, because we see that many actors around the world, including our potential adversaries, use a whole range of tools at their disposal at the same time, often in a very well coordinated way. And those tools can be military, political, economic, energy, information, so a whole range of tools at the same time. Often with the aim to challenge our institutions, to weaken trust in our democracies, and fundamentally to undermine our security. So it's also the time for us to be more deliberate about taking a more comprehensive approach to our own security, and that in particular by putting increasing focus on resilience. Because, of course, it's important to have strong militaries, but if you don't have strong societies, then you will not be strong. So strong societies, I think, are increasingly seen as our first line of defense. Therefore, the increased focus on strengthening national resilience, because, of course, resilience is primarily a national remit, but NATO can support allies in strengthening the resilience of their societies. And actually, we've been doing that since 2014. However, we're now looking at how we can achieve a broader, a more integrated approach to resilience. For instance, by having concrete national targets on areas such as communications, including 5G, underseas cables, energy, water supplies, and others. And we're also looking at having a joint and regular assessment of our vulnerabilities, because of course we are only as strong as our strongest link. Also, part of broadening our approach to security is looking at further, more innovative ways to maintain our technological edge. We see very fast progress on technology, very competitive in terms of emerging and disruptive technologies. So we need to make sure that our forces remain interoperable, that we can still work together, that there are no massive technology gaps between one ally and another. You know, it could be, for instance, on issues such as telecommunications, but also in terms of equipment. But we're also looking at how we can together help develop ethical standards on the use of new and disruptive technologies. And broadening our approach to security also means looking at the security impacts of climate change, because this is an issue of great concern to all of us. It affects all of us. NATO will not be the first or the main actor dealing with that, but climate change does have an impact on what we do, on how we do it, and we also have a role in addressing it. So that's something that, again, you know, happy to discuss later in greater detail if you wish. Finally, and importantly, the third priority in the NATO 2030 proposals, looking to the summit, is that Europe and North America must do more to defend the international rules-based order, because we see it's being challenged by authoritarian powers, and that has consequences both for our security and for our way of life. So, as you probably know, NATO already has a wide range of partner countries around the world, from Europe to Asia to Latin America. But we're now looking at how we can further deepen our relationships with close partners such as Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and also forge new partnerships in order to create what you could call a community of like-minded democracies. But of course, encouraging others to play by the rules can only be credible if we do so ourselves. And defending our rules, our values starts at home, which is why, as we look to the summit, this is also a moment where allies should recommit to our values, strengthen our democracies, and protect the institutions that can safeguard the rules-based order. So, despite all the evolving challenges, despite the differences that we sometimes have, you can see that the transatlantic relationship has proved resilient in itself. It's endured, because if it is in the, if you will, enlightened self-interest of all the countries that are part of it, it's good for Europe, it's good for North America, and because we live in an unpredictable world and in an increasingly unpredictable world, it's in our interest also as individuals to keep these ties strong and to do what we can to focus on what unites us. So with that, I will stop here and look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oana, for your insightful remarks. As we now transfer to the Q&A session of this event, let me ask you a starting question because there's been a lot of discussion about this NATO reform proposals. There has been some criticism, mainly coming from France, but also from some other member states, on aspects that might have fallen short in some capitals' views. Do you believe that one summit will be enough for NATO leaders to decide on a common way forward? And can the reform proposals satisfy all of the allies in the end?
Well, obviously, this is about squaring the circle, as always in NATO, with 30 member states. There will always be slightly different agendas, but I think at the end, what matters is that all agree, and we also saw that at the recent meeting of defense ministers, as you said, with US Secretary Lloyd Austin for the first time, that everyone agrees that we need a forward-looking agenda, a substantive agenda for the summit. Because leaders will not just meet because they want to meet, nice though that might be. They also meet because it focuses minds, it catalyzes action. So this is an opportunity for our nations to put forward an agenda that can make NATO future-proof, make it even fitter for the future. This has been a long process, which was kicked off actually by the NATO leaders at their London summit back in 2019, in December 2019, when they decided to look for ways to strengthen NATO. And the Secretary General had the mandate to steer that process, and by consulting very widely, as I was saying, with a group of independent experts whom he appointed and who presented their report, then with young leaders who, again, he appointed and who presented their report with, again, different angles, different inputs, and a wide range of consultations with industry, with civil society, with think tanks, with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and of course with capitals and with ambassadors here. I think this is a very exciting process, which is still ongoing. So discussions are ongoing as we speak on different aspects of the proposals for NATO 2030 and how we can best move forward so that we have an agenda that will be a solid platform for the future of the transatlantic alliance. So I would expect further discussions on this at the meeting of NATO foreign ministers before the Secretary General finalizes his proposals. But I think what matters most of all is that this is a moment which everybody has a responsibility to seize, a moment to recommit to ourselves, to each other, to our fundamental values, and to adapt NATO further for the challenges that we face.
Thanks, Oana. With that, I suggest we open the floor to our audience. Please raise your hand here in Zoom and also state your name and affiliation. I would also kindly suggest that you use headphones so we can hear you properly. Okay. First up, Tanya, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Alexandra, for the floor. And thank you very much, Oana, for this super insightful information and also for shedding some spotlight on the NATO Young Leaders Group. Much appreciated. I would have two questions. First, it will be if you could give us a bit of a sneak peek into the more procedural, if you will, part of the NATO 2030 process. So how will these recommendations, all this super rich input that the SecGen has received from, you named it, the young leaders, the private sector, the NATO PA and so on, how will they be taken on board? Is the office of the SecGen selecting some of them and proposing them to nations, or how does it work in practice? And the second one, I was really happy to hear that this more comprehensive view of security is starting to make a bit more headway into the mainstream and including in NATO. And as you know, the NATO 2030 Young Leaders emphasize this aspect very much in our report. And for us, however, reconceptualizing security without reconceptualizing burden sharing wouldn't be complete. So in this sense, our group recommended a reform basically of the 2% defense spending metric. And we suggested that allies begin now as we undergo the NATO 2030 process, so that by 2024, we can come up with a new metric that is much more inclusive of all the different efforts that allies have to undertake to ensure this more comprehensive security, including, for instance, efforts on resilience. So the question is here, how do you think this idea will fly in the neck? And how, I mean, arguably, this is the perfect occasion to have this conversation, but what is the political climate to act? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tanya, and thanks for your contribution to the Young Leaders Group, the Youth Summit, and hopefully some of you will have also seen the hackathon, which I thought was super exciting, and we hope to do again. In terms of the procedure, so the Secretary General has collected all these inputs. There is a lot of material, as you say, so his focus has not been to tackle everything, because the main point is that he wanted to focus on a handful of strategic level recommendations, which he put forward at the defense ministerial just before the meeting of defense ministers, and have started to be discussed by the defense ministers, and discussions are ongoing, as I said, and will continue with the foreign ministers. And then he will continue to refine his proposals so that he can put a package to the leaders when they meet. So this is the procedure. And of course, because there are so many ideas, we're also collecting all those ideas and looking at how some of them may be very big ideas, some of them may be smaller ideas, more focused on processes, others may be focused on big things that are happening out there. So a lot of those new ideas will be taken into account in different ways through the procedures that we have in NATO, through the different committees, feeding into some of the existing ongoing work. So rest assured that what you've done is being taken into account, even though you may not find chapter and verse of the Young Leaders report, or indeed the independent experts report, in the final proposals, which by their very nature have to be quite focused and strategic, as I said. One thing which the Secretary General has raised, and also follows from the discussions that you had with the young leaders, is how can we improve burden sharing? Because the reality is that burden sharing, as things stand, is not entirely fair across the alliance. So we need to make sure that there is and continues to be progress across all areas. And we do have good news, which Secretary General has also focused on at the meeting of defense ministers, which is that this is the 7th year in a row where defense investment, defense spending, the national budgets of allies in Europe and Canada have continued to increase. And this increasing trend is actually very important, because we have seen that from the 2014 commitment at the Wales Summit to improve burden sharing across the alliance, allies have taken that seriously and are acting on it. So right now we have 9 allies that are investing 2% of their gross defense, gross domestic product on defense, and almost all allies, or a large majority of allies, are investing 20% of that on new equipment. Moreover, we see continued contributions to our missions and operations, the whole range of missions and operations that we do, which lead us to these 3 C's: cash, capabilities, and contributions. So this is in short, the commitment which nations have made in 2014. They are making good on that commitment, but of course, a lot still has to be done. The aim of the NATO 2030 agenda is not to rewrite those commitments. It's not about going back on the commitments that were made back in 2014 at the highest level, the level of heads of state and government. It's about how we can make sure that we keep the momentum, that we find perhaps more ways that can help us achieve that goal of fairer burden sharing across the alliance. And one suggestion which the Secretary General has made would be to fund together some of the activities that we do for collective defense and deterrence on the territory of the alliance, because that would make them more sustainable in the long term. For instance, if you look at the multinational battle groups in the Baltic Sea region, those have 4 framework nations, Germany, the UK, Canada, and the United States, which have to pay for that deployment themselves. The same for the countries that deploy, for instance, in the multinational brigade in Romania. So the same for Baltic air policing. So can we find ways to make that burden, to distribute that burden a bit more fairly across the alliance and to contribute to some of those costs? So these are some of the ideas that are out there and that are currently being discussed.
Thanks, Oana. Next up is Marketa. Go ahead, unmute.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. So I would like to ask regarding the issue of countering disinformation, which we've already mentioned. I know there is a NATO approach publicly placed on NATO's website, even how to counter disinformation which relate to COVID. But I would like to ask what NATO does practically these days to counter the disinformation narratives originally based in China or Russia, and these our adversaries' outlets, let's say, which are spreading through Europe and probably also through North America, and also affect the opinions of the political leaders because they have to reflect what is the public demand. And if there is a part of the voters who support and trust and are manipulated by this disinformation, it basically affects also the decision-making process of the politicians. So how NATO advise member states and maybe the political leaders or their advisors to deal with this, and what the alliance can do practically to stop the spread of these disinformations? Thank you.
Thank you, Marketa. There's, I think, first of all, we need to be aware of the problem and to analyze it and to understand the trends. What we have seen, especially with COVID-19, so what we've seen since the beginning of last year has been a growing convergence of Russian and Chinese narratives, specifically on COVID-19 or related themes, and a reinforcement of each other's key messages. And we are measuring and following these trends. And we saw that, for instance, last year at the height of the pandemic, there was a 300-fold increase in the amount of tweets, for instance, from some of the official or main Russian and Chinese Twitter accounts. So just to take a snapshot of a particular set of messaging platforms. Some of that convergence seems to be opportunistic. It's just that there is a message that is convenient to one of the two countries, and so they just reinforce it. Some of the convergence seems to be more deliberate. We have seen, for instance, the Russian and the Chinese foreign ministers meeting and discussing ways to coordinate their approach to what they call countering disinformation against their own countries. But be that as it might, what we do see is what appears to be a coordinated attempt to some extent to undermine the faith in democracies and in the ability of democratic systems and societies to deal with a threat such as COVID-19. And the narrative seems to be that it is authoritarian systems that are more effective in countering COVID-19, or, for instance, developing their own vaccines. And we've seen a lot of disinformation related to vaccines and the ability of vaccines developed in some of our own countries to deal with COVID-19 as compared to Chinese and Russian vaccines. Now, we've seen a lot of discussion on vaccine diplomacy. We've seen a lot of disinformation on vaccines. So we also need to be aware that NATO is not the first actor to deal with disinformation on vaccines. That is primarily for the nations themselves, for the United Nations, for the World Health Organization, to a certain extent, the European Union. And I think they are all working very hard to present the facts, the scientific facts to their publics. And also, obviously, to be able to distribute vaccines across, for instance, the European Union. What we can do is to, as I said, analyze and follow those trends to the extent to which they have a risk, a potential to affect our security and to affect NATO itself, to support our NATO allies in building up their own resilience, their own capabilities in terms of countering disinformation, to coordinate and to cooperate with other international organizations like the UN, like the EU, that are working on these issues, and to amplify their own content so that a broader range of publics becomes aware of disinformation issues related to this. And this is what we have been doing. I think our main role as NATO, as I said, is to make sure that what is now a health crisis does not turn into a security crisis. So our main role is to make sure that we remain ready and able to defend and protect our nations. And despite all the measures that we need to take, all the precautionary measures we need to take related to COVID, we have been able to do that, and we must continue to do that. Finally, I think the most important point, both for us as NATO and for NATO allies themselves, is that we focus on our own messages, on our own proactive communications. And during the height of the COVID-19 crisis here in Europe last spring and throughout the summer, our main focus was on communicating what NATO allies were doing to support each other and to support their own people, what we were doing to support our partners who perhaps had less access to protective equipment, for instance, and to communicate this message of unity and solidarity and readiness. And I think that is the most important thing that we can do. We have been, we've seen disinformation directed at NATO itself. Again, in particular, last year at the height of the crisis in Europe, we saw several targeted disinformation attacks against 3 of our countries in the space of 2 days in April 2020, which we rebutted very strongly and very quickly, mainly at the level of our national authorities, not through NATO HQ. Because it was our national authorities in each of the countries, and in that case, it was Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, that were able to deal with those disinformation attacks, which were clearly coordinated and directed at the readiness of our troops in the COVID-19 context. That's how we managed to push back. We will continue to see this sort of attacks. I think we need to be aware. We should also not overreact. I think we need to choose where we spend our resources and time. But the focus must be on communicating our own messages and on coordinating amongst ourselves and supporting each other where we can.
Next up is Gergana Georgieva. Please unmute. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Gergana Georgieva. I have one question. One of the Secretary General's proposals for the NATO 2030 initiative that he outlined in the press conference after the defense ministers meeting was to establish a NATO defense innovation initiative to promote interoperability and serve as a catalyst for transatlantic cooperation on defense innovation. I think it is a great idea, but can you elaborate more on this initiative? What could be the focus of this initiative? What will be the time scope, the structure, the procedures, and do you see this initiative as implementable in the near future? Thank you.
Okay, that's a great question, and I see you've really been looking very hard into all the details. These are proposals which obviously are based to a large extent on work that is already ongoing in terms of dealing with emerging and disruptive technologies. So we have several areas that we have been focusing on for the last few years, areas such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, but also unmanned vehicles of different types. So there are certain areas that we are focusing on. We have a roadmap which we're developing already on implementing this strategy, dealing with emerging and disruptive technologies. And the question for the summit is how can we do this faster? How can we bring in a broader network from industry, startups, various funding mechanisms, for instance, academia, of course, think tanks, and how can we strengthen this ecosystem to foster technological innovation in NATO as a transatlantic alliance, to make sure that NATO remains at the forefront of technological innovation, which we see is revolutionizing both the way we live our lives and the ways wars are fought. So this is something that is very much on the agenda. I'm not going to be able to give you many more details at this stage, but it is something that we are focusing on because NATO has been able to keep its technological edge for 70 years. We see that it's being undermined to a certain extent right now. So it's really important that we regain the initiative, and to do that, we must continue to work together, Europe and North America together.
We have another question from Lorenzo Giulietti, who's unfortunately unable to ask the questions due to technical difficulties. So I will read it for him. He's asking, what's next for the NATO-EU cooperation in the alliance agenda, and to what extent is this partnership seen as an element to broaden and boost NATO's approach towards security?
This is a really important question, and the partnership between NATO and the European Union, of course, is a strategic partnership, not just because we happen to be headquartered in the same city, but also because 90% of EU citizens actually live in a NATO country. And we have, of course, we have 21 countries in common. We have the same neighborhood in common. We face the same challenges. So it's really important that we work together. And I can say that in the past decade or so, relations between NATO and the EU have reached really unprecedented levels. In particular, since 2014, we've seen several joint statements between NATO and European Union leaders, which have created a platform for work on very specific areas, 74 areas that we're working on together. And they vary widely. For instance, on cyber, I think we've been doing a lot of great work together. For instance, exchanging information in real time between our cyber security threat centers, creating a malware platform where we can share information about threats that are coming up. The same thing on migration. You may remember that NATO set up a mission in the Aegean very quickly to support the EU-Turkey agreement on migration. And that is a mission that is still ongoing. But also in supporting our partners, whether they're partners in the eastern neighborhood, such as Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, but also further afield, as in Afghanistan or Iraq, where NATO has training missions, and the EU is also a very important donor and contributor to creating a safer future for those countries. So we're already doing a lot in common. The question now is what more we should be doing, and how we can deepen our cooperation in the areas where we're already working together. And you may have seen that the Secretary General, for instance, was invited by the President of the Council, Charles Michel, to address the European Council last week. So he addressed EU leaders, many of whom are also NATO leaders, on the future of the alliance, the importance of the transatlantic bond, and how we can take this forward together. He was also the first NATO leader to address the College of Commissioners at the invitation of President Ursula von der Leyen. And of course, he also engages regularly with the European Parliament. So overall, I think the Secretary General has been on the record repeatedly. You will have seen him again and again stressing his support for the efforts that the European Union is doing on defense, especially on capability development, but also on investments. on reducing the fragmentation of the European defense industry. All these things are really important because they also contribute to stronger national defenses, of course, but they also contribute to fairer burden sharing across the alliance. The point that the Secretary General has also made is that at the same time, the European Union as such is not in a position to defend the whole of Europe. And that is not just because only 20% of the defense expenditure in NATO countries actually comes from EU member states. So it's not just to do with money, it's also to do with geography. Again, you only need to look at the map to see the importance of the UK, Canada, the United States, but also Iceland, Norway, Turkey, countries in the Balkans that are part of NATO but not of the EU. And also the political importance of maintaining the transatlantic alliance in strategic solidarity, because in the end, NATO has a key role to play in the defense of Europe. And of course, it's very important that we work together, keeping in mind that we remain different institutions, but of course, working very closely together.
I see that our time is running out. We can take one more question. John, you had your hand raised.
Right, that's very nice of you, Alex, that I get the closing question. Oana, thank you very much for joining us today and in this session. That's absolutely wonderful. So I'm going to try, and I won't get my answer. And I think that from Jane's, they already tried it during the DevMin. But could you give us any idea about a possible date or a month, or what kind of thing are we looking at? Are we talking about before summer, or is it going to be another Christmas dinner meeting as we had in London? What's going to be?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's an excellent question. And I would have been surprised if it had not been asked by young journalists and by the Atlantic Forum. Look, the hope is that the NATO summit will be in the first part of this year here in Brussels. That much we know. I think everybody is looking very much forward to having it. When exactly? What is the date? Is it going to be in April, May, or June, or later? Frankly, I don't think any of us knows. The teams are working very hard, as you can imagine, in all capitals to identify a date that will work. I will be very honest and tell you that some of it, I think, depends not just on the political will to have a NATO summit, but also on how we manage to deal with the COVID situation in our own countries. Because I think it's going to be very difficult for any of our national leaders to spend time in Brussels if there are still difficulties back home with vaccination programs or another variant of the virus appearing. So in a way, this shows again the unpredictability of the world we have to live in and to organize summits in. I think as national leaders will need to be certain that they have the COVID situation under control before starting to engage in long trips abroad. And obviously, a NATO summit is important. I think there is a recognition that it's even more important these days to have it in person by taking all the necessary measures to ensure that both national leaders and their delegations and everybody else is safe. So everybody wants to organize a great summit, but it also has to be a safe summit.
Thanks, Oana. So we're looking forward to that summit, hopefully very soon. Thank you very much for joining us today. We wish you all the best of luck in the months leading up to the summit. And thanks also to our audience for following this kickoff event, and stay tuned at Atlantic Forum events because there will be more in the next few months. Thanks everyone, and have a great Tuesday.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And thank you very much, Atlantic Forum, and everybody who took part, and stay safe.
Stop the video.
Okay.